Texas Territory, 1879. Noon light cut through the dust like a blade, carving the square of red hollow into heat and shadow. The air smelled of horses, iron, and the slow rot of sweat baked into leather. Voices rose and tangled with the clank of spurs and the lazy whine of flies. A woman knelt in the center, barefoot, shaking, her skin still slick with the ache of birth. The newborn in her arms whimpered once, too soft to be heard over the laughter. Her name was Ilara Wynne, though no one cared to ask. Someone had tied her to a post like she might run, though she could hardly stand. The blood beneath her knees had dried to brown dust. 2 for 1, the auctioneer barked. His vest gleamed with sweat, his smile the color of old tobacco. Young enough to mend, and the whelp to start your legacy. The crowd hooted, jostling closer. A man whistled, another spat. Ilara stared down at the planks, pressing her lips to her child's damp hair. The wood beneath her knees throbbed with the crowd's rhythm, boots, voices, hunger. She had stopped crying hours ago. Crying only drew the wrong kind of mercy. 50 for the pair, the man shouted. Still bleeding, still breathing. Come on now, who'll start the count? Numbers clashed and rose, loud as thunder. The sun hammered her shoulders, the smell of metal and heat filling her lungs. 50, 70, 100. She felt her heart slow, a dull weight in her chest. One hand shielded the child's face from the light, though her fingers trembled. Then, from the edge of the square, a voice. Calm, even, cutting through the noise like a boot through mud. 300. The square froze. Heads turned. The voice belonged to a tall man standing alone at the back. His coat was long, his hat low, shadowing most of his face. Dust clung to his boots, and a single line of sweat traced his jaw. His name would be spoken later as Boone Mercer, but in that moment, no one knew him. 300, the auctioneer scoffed. Sir, that's... You heard me. Murmurs rippled like dry grass in wind. Hell of a price for pity, someone called. Boone didn't look up. It's not pity. What's your intent? The auctioneer demanded, forcing a laugh. Boone's hand brushed the revolver at his side, not drawing it, just reminding the air. To give her a bed. To let her sleep. The square went silent. A hawk screamed somewhere beyond the roofs. He stepped forward. The boards groaned under his boots. The sun caught the edge of his collarbone, scarred white like an old burn. When he reached the stage, he didn't look at the crowd, only at Ilara. The chain around her ankle glinted once. A single cruel flash. Boone drew a knife from his belt. The blade whispered as it cut through the iron link. The chain fell to the dirt with a flat, final sound. Ilara flinched. The child whimpered. He offered her his hand. She stared at it, pale, hollow-eyed. Her voice cracked like old wood. What do you want from me? Boone's face didn't move. Sleep. Then we'll talk like people. The auctioneer's gavel hit the table once. Sold, he muttered, as if the word itself felt wrong in his mouth. Boone waited. Ilara didn't take his hand. Instead, she forced herself to stand, the child tight against her chest. The crowd parted, dust curling around her bare feet. Every step left a faint red print on the planks. At the edge of the square, the wind picked up, carrying the dry sound of chains hitting dirt. Boone fell in step behind her, silent. Somewhere behind them, a man in the crowd muttered, "Won't last the night." But as the sun dipped behind the low hills and the heat turned to a softer ache, Ilara kept walking. Her legs shook, her arms ached, yet she didn't stop. She didn't know where this stranger was taking her, or what waited beyond the line of fences. Only that the road ahead smelled of cedar and dust, not blood. And for the first time since dawn, the wind didn't taste like iron. Still, she never looked back. The baby slept, breath small against her collarbone, and somewhere deep inside the noise of her heart, a thought flickered. Fragile, forbidden, almost a sin. Maybe the world had not ended yet. A lone bell rang from the auction post, echoing through the empty square. It sounded less like a sale now, and more like a warning that something old had just cracked open. The sun was sinking low when the crowd began to scatter, boots grinding dust into the boards where the chain still lay. Red Hollow's noise faded into a dull hum behind them. Boone Mercer led his horse by the reins, his stride steady, boots marking the road that bled west into open country. Ilara followed a few paces back, barefoot, her dress stiff with dried blood. The newborn stirred in her arms, letting out a breath that barely reached the wind. The land smelled of dust and cedar, the kind of dry scent that carried both life and ash. The wind dragged at her hair, catching threads of sweat that burned her eyes. She wanted to speak, but her voice sat heavy in her throat. The man ahead didn't turn or offer words. Only once, when her knees nearly buckled, did he slow enough for her to keep pace. "Where are we going?" she asked, voice rasped raw. "Out of sight," he said simply. "For now, that's far enough." His tone carried no threat, no comfort either, just the solid shape of truth. They passed the last split-rail fence before the prairie opened wide. The light stretched long and gold, catching on the hills like breath held too long. A hawk wheeled overhead, a black speck moving through all that space. For the first time that day, no one watched her. No hands reached, no voices laughed. The silence pressed hard enough to make her tremble. Boone stopped where the land rose slightly and pointed ahead. A cabin crouched against the slope, half shadowed by a wind-twisted oak. Smoke trickled from its chimney, thin, gray, patient. "That's mine," he said. "You'll rest there." Ilara's fingers tightened on the baby. "Why me?" Boone's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Because someone should have done it sooner." She almost laughed, but it came out as a cough. "And if I don't want your kindness?" "Then you can sleep and leave before sunrise," he said, not unkindly. She said nothing more. By the time they reached the cabin, the light had turned copper. The walls glowed like old coins. Boone tied the horse to a post, then unlatched the door. Inside was dim. One cot, one small stove, a table with a tin bowl and a half-burned candle. A folded blanket waited at the foot of the bed, clean enough to be strange. He filled a kettle from a jug, set it on the stove, then turned to her. You need sleep. The child more than you. Ilara's arms tightened. If you try to touch me, I won't, he said. I've got no use for fear in my house. She believed him less than she wanted to. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small pouch of oats, and set it near the stove. Eat when you can. Then he moved toward the door. The room shifted when he left, like breath leaving a lung. She could still hear him outside, the slow scrape of his boots across the porch, the low sound of his horse stamping. Ilara laid the baby on the cot and stared at the walls. They smelled of pine and smoke, honest smells, not like the sweat of the square. She pressed her ear close to the child's chest, counting the small thuds. Each one was proof that she hadn't died yet. When she looked to the window, she saw Boone sitting under the oak. He had lit a lamp, a small glass one steady against the wind. The flame flickered, then held. He wasn't watching her. His eyes were on the horizon, as if waiting for something to arrive from the dark. For a moment she thought of turning the other way, taking the baby and vanishing into the hills. But the weight in her legs said otherwise. The world beyond that lamp looked too wide, too cold. She slid down beside the cot, pulled the blanket to her chin. The floor creaked, the wind shifted, and the baby sighed in sleep. Outside, the flame in the lamp swayed once, then steadied again. Ilara closed her eyes. She didn't trust this man, not yet. But the sound of the lamp's glass breathing against the wind was the first sound that hadn't meant danger. It was enough to keep her awake just a little longer, afraid that if she slept, it might all disappear. And somewhere outside, the quiet voice of Boone Mercer broke through the wind, almost too soft to be real. Sleep, Miss Wynne. Nobody's coming. But even then, she kept one hand on the knife hidden under her blanket and one on the child's chest, just in case. Night came down without warning, a slow drowning in blue. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, whispering through cracks like a voice unsure of its place. The air smelled of wood ash, and the faint sour of milk turned warm too long. Ilara lay still beside the cot, the baby's breath small and rhythmic, her own caught between waking and sleep. Outside, the lantern still burned, its flame trapped behind glass, swaying with each gust that crossed the porch. It cast a soft amber line through the window, slicing the dark across the floorboards. One trembling vein of light she could almost trust. Every sound found a shape that night. The pop of the stove's cooling iron, the slow tread of Boone's boots on the porch, the sigh of the horse tethered nearby. None of it sounded like danger, yet her body stayed ready. Fear had learned her heartbeat too well to leave easy. She pressed her fingers to the baby's chest, tiny, quick, alive. For the first time, she noticed the warmth of the blanket against her skin, how the fabric smelled faintly of cedar and sun. No blood, no filth, just clean. It felt foreign, like touching something borrowed from another life. Her eyes drifted toward the window again. Boone sat there under the oak, coat collar turned up, hat low over his brow. The lantern painted him in slow amber strokes, dust, leather, and the pale curve of a scar across his jaw. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the dark, like it might try to come closer. Something inside her twisted then. Not fear, not yet trust either. Just a strange ache that maybe protection could come without a price. She closed her eyes, but memory found her anyway. A flash of the square, men shouting, coins clattering on a table, a hand yanking her head back by the hair. "Don't drop it, girl." The words still clung to her skin like flies. She blinked, and the present came back with the sound of the lantern's glass clicking in the wind. Her pulse slowed. She whispered into the dark, almost too softly to hear, "It's over." The words didn't feel true, but they felt possible. Boone moved once, shifting his shoulders, and the sound startled her. She gripped the knife under the blanket so tight her knuckles burned. But he didn't come in. The boards creaked once more, then stilled. Minutes passed, or hours. She couldn't tell. The moon climbed behind the oak, washing the room in silver. Ash stirred, whimpering. She lifted him against her chest, rocking slow. Her voice, hoarse from silence, found a thread of melody she didn't know she remembered. Not a lullaby, just a hum. The kind that belonged to fields and windmills, not cages and walls. The baby calmed, his breath sinking to hers. For the first time, her body loosened. Her back sank into the wall. Her knife hand drifted down. A faint thud came from outside. The sound of a boot on wood, measured and calm. Boone's voice followed, low as earth. "You're safe here, Miss Wynne." She didn't answer. The words folded into the air, neither accepted nor denied, but she felt them settle somewhere under her ribs, a warmth she didn't want to name. The wind turned colder. She pulled the blanket higher and watched the flame through the glass. It leaned once as if bowing to the night, then straightened again, steady, stubborn. She wondered if that's what surviving really meant. Not strength, just refusing to go out. The baby slept, his tiny fingers curled around her dress string. Ilara traced the ridge of his palm and thought of the future in the smallest way. Just another dawn, another day of breath. When her eyes finally closed, she dreamed not of chains, but of the smell of pine smoke and bread baking somewhere she'd never been. And just before sleep took her, she thought she heard Boone's voice again, softer this time, carried through the wind like a secret he didn't mean for her to catch. "Rest easy, ma'am. I'll keep watch." The knife stayed beneath her hand, but her grip had loosened. Outside, the flame flickered once more, steady and alive, a small defiance against the dark stretching across the prairie. The first light slid through the cracks in the shutters like water finding its way through stone. It painted the walls in pale stripes, gray and gold. Ilara woke to the smell of smoke and something warm, Oats, maybe, or bread, faintly sweet. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the ache in her shoulders returned, the memory of the auction square snapping back like a whip. Ash stirred beside her, small and pink against the worn blanket. His hand brushed her chin. She exhaled, the sound breaking the hush of morning. The air was cool, damp from the night. Outside a horse snorted. Somewhere a metal bucket clanged against wood. She rose slowly, every muscle protesting, and checked the window. Boone was already awake. He moved through the yard, tall and silent, sleeves rolled up, fetching water from the pump. Steam rose from a pot balanced on the porch rail. When she turned, her eyes caught something new. On the table lay a small loaf of bread, still warm, and a tin cup of milk. Next to it, folded neat, was a square of cloth she hadn't noticed before. A handkerchief, pale cream, edges embroidered with leaves of sage. The thread shimmered faintly, green against the morning light. Her first thought was suspicion. Gifts came with chains, always had. But the cloth was simple, unpretending. She reached out, hesitated, then touched it with the tips of her fingers. It was softer than she expected, worn thin by use, smelling faintly of cedar. She turned the corner of it in her hand. Someone had once taken care sewing that edge. Small, careful stitches, meant to last. The door creaked. Boone's boots sounded against the threshold. "You're awake," he said. Alara stiffened. "You left food." He nodded once. "You'll need it. The oats are fresh. I'll bring more flour by noon." "You don't have to." "I know." His voice carried nothing but plain fact. That might have been what unsettled her most. Boone poured the kettle into a tin mug and set it near her elbow. "Drink slow. It's strong." The steam curled up, carrying the smell of black coffee and smoke. Alara's hand trembled when she reached for it. Her body still remembered too much hunger to trust an easy kindness. Boone leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "You got a name for the child?" She hesitated, the question catching her unprepared. "Not yet." He looked toward the cot where the baby slept, face round, unknowing. "Then you'll find one. Everyone should have a name before sunrise." He left the words hanging and stepped back outside. The wind took them from the doorway, carried them out toward the pasture. Alara stood for a long time after he was gone. The coffee cooled in her hand. The baby breathed soft behind her. She folded the handkerchief again, smaller now, careful not to wrinkle the stitched edge. Through the window she watched Boone moving through the yard. He knelt to mend a broken fence rail, his motions deliberate, unhurried, the kind of patience that looked like solitude. And something in the stillness of that picture, man, land, morning, made her chest ache. She sat down at the table, broke the bread in half, and fed herself with fingers that still shook. Each bite was dry but clean. Outside, Boone's shadow passed across the window once more. He didn't look in, but she sensed he knew she was watching. The baby whimpered, a small sound like a bird under its breath. She turned to him, brushing a finger over his cheek. His skin felt impossibly soft, the kind of softness that hadn't learned pain yet. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Ash." The name came out before she could stop it, like the memory of something burned but not lost. When she lifted her head, her eyes caught the lantern still hanging under the porch roof. Its flame had died in the early hours, but the glass still glowed faintly gold from the last ember of dawn. Elara touched the handkerchief once more, folded it into the pocket of her dress, and felt the faintest tug of warmth settle under her ribs. Outside, Boone's voice reached her again, calm, unforced. "Storm coming tonight," he said without turning. "Best rest while you can." She didn't answer, but when he walked back toward the barn, she found herself whispering to the empty room, "I will." The baby slept on. The window light brightened, spilling across the table and catching the thread of sage green in her pocket. For Carton, the first time in years, the day didn't start with orders or fear, only the sound of wind in the grass and a stranger's kindness waiting without demand. Yet even as calm settled in, she felt a shiver of unease, like the earth itself holding its breath for what came next. The storm came slow and steady, not with thunder, but with a long, low growl of wind that pushed the clouds together until the sky turned the color of pewter. By dusk, the air had thickened to a dull hum. The world smelled of wet dust and smoke. Elara stood by the small window, watching Boone secure the shutters on the barn. His movements were careful, the kind that spoke of long practice rather than fear. Every so often, he'd glance toward the cabin, not to check on her, but to make sure the lamp still burned. The child slept through the first gusts. Rain began to tick against the roof, soft at first, then harder. The rhythm steadied her heartbeat. Boone's boots sounded on the porch. He pushed open the door without hurry, bringing the smell of rain inside. Water streaked his coat, darkening the edges. "You'll want to keep that blanket close," he said, voice low over the wind. "Roof's tight, but she creaks when the storm leans heavy." Elara nodded. Her eyes followed him as he crossed to the table and set down a tin bowl filled with something warm. "Soup," he said, "from Mabel Quinn's pot over in town. She sends enough for two." Elara hesitated, then took the bowl. Steam rose into her face, rich with onion and thyme. It wasn't the kind of food she'd known. Too gentle to be survival, too humble to be luxury. Boone leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, listening to the storm's hiss. "You always keep your lamp lit?" she asked. He looked over, brow lifting slightly. "Most nights." "Why?" "So folks passing know they're seen," he said. "It's a hard thing, not being seen." The words caught her. She stared into the bowl, feeling heat rise behind her eyes. There was no reply worth giving. He watched her for a moment longer, then reached into a wooden crate near the door. "Here," he said, setting down a small brass lantern, its glass cleaned to a shine. He struck a match, and the wick flared. soft, steady. "This one's for you," he said. "Keep it lit if you chum. Stay." She blinked. "And if I don't?" "Then leave it on the porch. Someone else might need the light." He said it simply, no demand in it. Then he stepped back into the rain, pulling the door closed behind him. The cabin fell quiet again. The only sounds the rain and the baby's small sighs. Ilara ate in silence, each spoonful heavy with something unfamiliar. Trust, maybe, or the echo of it. When she finished, she lit the new lantern and set it by the window. The flame wavered once, then steadied. Its reflection in the glass looked like another world waiting just beyond. The kind of place where people stayed instead of ran. She sat by the cot, watching the storm. Each flash of lightning caught the carved bird Boone had left on the sill, its wings unfinished, a single eye sanded smooth. It wasn't beautiful, not yet, but it was becoming. As the rain eased, her shoulders loosened. The air turned cool and smelled of sage and wet earth. For a moment she forgot the weight of the knife under her pillow. Outside, Boone's lantern glowed under the porch, and hers answered from the window. Two small lights in the dark, breathing in the same wind. She whispered to the child, "We're still here," and surprised herself with how the words didn't sound like fear. Hours later, when the wind died and the storm passed, she peeked through the curtain. Boone sat under the oak again, coat draped over his shoulders, watching the horizon that no longer threatened. The lantern at his feet flickered against the puddles, drawing rings of gold across the mud. She should have turned away, but something in her stayed fixed on that quiet figure, the steady patience of him, the kind of stillness that wasn't emptiness, but choice. When she finally lay down, she kept the lantern burning. Its glow climbed the ceiling beams, soft and gold. She thought she heard the wind whisper his words again. So folks passing know they're seen. Outside, the storm's last breath tugged at the porch chime, setting off a faint metallic hum. The sound settled in her chest like a heartbeat not her own. Sleep didn't come easily, but it came gentler this time. And somewhere between the hush and her dreams, she realized she'd left the knife untouched. By late noon, the storm had emptied itself, leaving the sky washed pale as bone. The ground steamed in places, scent of wet cedar rising with each breath of wind. Boone was in the yard fixing a fence post when the dust on the far road began to move again. Thin at first, then swelling, twisting upward in a slow, deliberate column. He stopped mid-hammer. The quiet of the land changed. Ilara felt it too. She'd been hanging damp clothes on a rope behind the cabin when the horses appeared. A line of 3 moving tight, the kind of formation men used when they came with a purpose. Her fingers froze around the clothespin. The child on her hip stirred, sensing what she did not yet name. Boone straightened. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Inside," he said. Not loud, but the tone left no room. She obeyed. The air between them was different now. Not sharp, not panicked, but focused. She could hear the men's laughter before they even reached the gate. The lead rider was heavy-set, gray coat fraying at the edges, a silver ring flashing on his hand. Harlan Voss. She knew that voice before he spoke. It was the same drawl that had echoed over the square in Red Hollow, the one that had called her breeding stock. "Well, hell," Voss said, tugging his reins, smiling wide. "If it ain't the gallant Mr. Mercer. You've been hard to track." Boone didn't move. "You're off your land, Voss." "I'm off my property," the man corrected. His gaze slid toward the cabin window. "She's mine. Paper says so." He pulled a folded sheet from his coat. The kind of paper men like him thought turned breath into ownership. Boone wiped the sweat from his temple with the back of his wrist, then set the hammer down slow. "Paper don't own people. Not out here." The second rider chuckled, resting a hand on his rifle. "You making this legal, Mercer?" Boone met his eyes. "No," he said. "I'm making it right." The words hung between them, heavy as the air before. Lightning. Inside the cabin, Alara rocked Ash to keep him quiet. Through a slit in the curtain, she saw Boone's back. Straight and unmoving, his boots planted in the mud. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of iron, of something about to snap. Voss smirked. "I'll refund your 300. Call it even." Boone's hand hovered near his holster, but didn't rise. "At this ranch," he said quietly, "property doesn't breathe." The second man's laughter cut short. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the horses seemed to hold still, ears flat, waiting. Then Voss spit into the dirt. "Not worth the bullet," he muttered, jerking his reins. The others followed. Their hooves pounded off down the trail, dust rising again, smaller this time, retreating toward the horizon. Boone stood there long after the sound had faded. Only when the wind brought back the noise of cicadas did he turn toward the cabin. Alara met him at the door, shoulders tight. "You could have been killed." He shrugged, untying his gloves. "So could you." Her voice cracked. "They'll come back." "Maybe," he said. "Then they'll learn what kind of man lives here." She looked at him, searching for anger, and found none. Only the same stillness that had carried him through every silence since the auction. Boone stepped aside, letting her pass out into the light. The rain had washed the mud clean, but the sky still felt bruised. He knelt by the fence again, picked up his hammer, and went back to work. As if mending boards could mend the world. Alara watched him, arms wrapped around the sleeping child. For the first time, she saw not just a man who'd rescued her, but one who'd chosen to stand his ground for what was right, even when no one asked him to. The wind caught the edge of the sage-embroidered handkerchief in her pocket, fluttering it like a small white flag. "Thank you," she whispered, though he was too far to hear. As the sun dipped low, the dust from the departing riders thinned into gold. The air grew soft again, but something in her stayed taut, like a thread pulled tight across a wound not yet closed. Boone looked up once, hat brim cutting his eyes in shadow. "If you're staying," he said evenly, "the lamp'll need trimming before dark." Alara hesitated, then nodded. I'll see to it. When night came, 2 lanterns glowed again, the one on the porch and the one in the window. Between them, the air hummed with an unspoken promise. They would not run. The next morning came bright and sharp, the kind of light that cuts through fog but leaves the air trembling. The land was quiet, washed clean by rain, smelling of sage and wet iron. Boone had already gone to the fields, his silhouette bent among the posts like part of the fence itself. Inside the cabin, Alara sat on the cot with Ash in her lap. The baby blinked at the sunbeam crawling across the floorboards, tiny fingers reaching for it as if it were something he could hold. The gesture caught her, so small, so certain, and something inside her softened. Her ankle still carried a faint bruise where the chain had been. She rubbed the spot absently, as though touching an old dream. Outside, the wind hummed through the chime Boone had hung under the eaves. It wasn't pretty, just honest. Metal knocking metal, the sound of 2 things surviving together. She looked down at the child. You're just breath and heartbeat, she murmured. But maybe that's enough. From the porch came Boone's boots, heavy but even. He stepped in, hat in hand, hair damp with sweat. Morning, Miss Wynne, he said. Morning, she replied. Her voice still sounded strange when it wasn't trembling. He noticed the baby reaching for the light. He'll have strong hands, Boone said quietly. Knows where to reach. Alara smiled without meaning to. He needs a name. Boone leaned against the doorframe, nodding. Then give him one. Don't let the world do it for you. She hesitated. The last name she'd given anything was years ago. A small colt she'd raised before her father sold it to pay for whiskey. Names had always felt like lies, promises that ended too quick. But now the child's warmth against her chest steadied her. Ash, she said finally. He'll be called Ash. Boone tilted his head. Why that? Her gaze drifted toward the hearth. Because ash still holds heat after the fire dies. It remembers warmth. He nodded once. That's a good name. Silence filled the room. But it wasn't the hard kind anymore. Boone set a small bundle on the table. Cloth and thread. A needle stuck through the corner. Thought you might want this, he said. Stitch his name somewhere, it'll stay. Her fingers brushed the thread. It was coarse but strong, dyed the same green as the leaves on the handkerchief. She looked at him. You always fix what's broken? Boone shrugged. When I can. After he left, Alara threaded the needle and began to sew. Her hands weren't steady, but she took her time, pulling the thread through the old cloth she'd wrapped Ash in since that day at the square. Each letter took shape slowly, crooked but deliberate. A-S-H. The word looked fragile on the worn fabric, but it was real. Outside, Boone's whistle drifted back from the pasture. Low, tuneless, almost like talking to himself. The sound carried through the open window, mixing with the steady creak of the pump handle and the hum of wind. Alara tied off the thread and lifted the cloth to the light. For the first time, she felt that something in this place belonged to her, not by gift or purchase, but by choice. She laid the baby down, covered him with the stitched blanket, and stepped to the window. Boone was leading his horse toward the corral, his movements slow and even. When he looked up, their eyes met through the morning glare. He touched the brim of his hat. "That'll suit him fine," he said, as if he'd been waiting for her to finish. She smiled faintly, then turned back to the table, where the lantern still stood from the night before. The glass was smudged with soot. She wiped it clean, careful not to smother the faint scent of oil and smoke that clung to it. As she set it back on the sill, the light caught the green thread in the stitched letters, making them glow for an instant like tiny veins of fire. "He'll never be nameless," she whispered to herself. The chime rattled once in the wind, and far off, thunder rumbled. Not close, but near enough to remind her that peace out here always came with a shadow. She looked toward the horizon, where the line between land and sky shimmered with heat, and thought of the men who might still be out there, dusting off their pride. Still, she didn't close the shutters. She let the light in. The day stretched on quiet. Boone worked. She mended, fed the child, and hung the cloth to dry. And by evening, when the air turned gold again, she realized she hadn't once reached for the knife. When night fell, Boone lit the porch lantern himself. "We'll keep it burning," he said softly, more to the dark than to her. And Alara, standing in the doorway with Ash against her shoulder, found herself answering, "Yes, we will." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and something electric. The sky to the south bruised purple. Peace, it seemed, was only ever a pause between storms. The rain came back quiet. Just a fine mist at first, whispering against the roof like someone breathing through their teeth. The day had burned itself out early. By dusk, the hills were cloaked in a cold gray that clung to skin. Boone returned from the pasture with a limp in his step, mud climbing his boots, shoulders glistening with damp. When he pushed the door open, the air inside felt wrong. Heavy, still, warm in a way that meant trouble. Alara sat slumped beside the cot, her hair sticking to her temple, sweat gathering at her collarbone. Ash whimpered in her arms. Boone's eyes took in the picture at once. The red, her cheeks, the glassy stare. "You're burning," he said. "I'm fine," she murmured, voice thin as thread. "It's just the weather." Boone didn't argue. He pulled the kettle off the stove, poured cool water into a tin basin, and set it beside her. "Weather doesn't take your strength like that." He wrung out a cloth, pressed it against her forehead. She flinched. "You don't have to." "I know," he said again, "but I will." He moved like a man used to silence, no fuss, no wasted motion. He poured the old water from the basin, fetched clean from the pump outside, brought it back steaming and fragrant with sage leaves. "The fever'll break faster if you sweat it through," he said, half to himself. He pulled a chair close and sat beside her, one arm resting against his knee. Alara tried to protest, but her words turned to a shiver. The baby began to cry. Boone hesitated only a second before lifting Ash from her arms. The child's wails softened against his chest. Boone's hand was steady as he rocked him, large and careful, like he feared breaking something he couldn't fix. Ilara watched through half-closed eyes. She wanted to tell him not to touch, not to get close. But the sight of that quiet man cradling her son broke something loose inside her, something old and tired. When her breathing turned ragged, Boone dipped the cloth again, brushed it along her neck. "You've been running too long," he said softly. "Pitch first." "Body's catching up." She tried to smile, but her lips barely moved. "Don't waste your pity." "It ain't pity," he said. "It's watch-keeping." The word hung there, strange and gentle. Night deepened. The rain turned harder, washing the world clean of its noise. Boone kept his post by the cot, feeding the fire when it faltered, humming something low under his breath. It wasn't a song, just a rhythm, steady, patient, something that could have belonged to the land itself. Once, near midnight, Ilara stirred. Her fevered eyes found him still sitting there, Ash asleep in a makeshift cradle by his boot. "You should rest," she whispered. "I'll rest when you do," he said. She turned her head toward the window. The porch lantern still burned, its glow bending through the rain into ribbons of gold. "Why do you keep that light?" she asked, her voice barely there. "So the lost can find their way," Boone answered. "And what if they never come? Then I'll keep it burning anyway." Her breath slowed, steadied. Boone sat back, shoulders sagging but unyielding, eyes fixed on the wavering light outside. The cabin was small, but it held the weight of something bigger, an understanding that didn't need words. Toward dawn, the fever broke. The air cooled, and a thin beam of gray light spilled across the floor. Ilara woke to find Boone slumped in the chair, head tilted, the child asleep against his arm. His other hand still held the cloth she'd used to cool her brow, now dry and wrinkled. She watched him for a long time, the rise and fall of his chest, the quiet steadiness of his presence. Then she whispered, so softly it barely stirred the air, "You kept your word." Boone didn't wake. The lantern outside guttered once, then caught again, steady and alive. And for the first time since she could remember, Ilara Wynne slept without dreaming of chains. The summer heat returned without mercy. By noon, the sky was white, the kind of brightness that bleached color out of everything it touched. Boone worked alone in the corral, hammering a new frame for the gate. Sweat darkened his shirt. Dust clung to his skin. The rhythm of the hammer was steady, sure, until the ladder slipped. The crash tore through the air, sharp and final. Ilara, hanging laundry behind the cabin, froze. For a second, the world went still. Then the echo came, followed by a strangled curse. She ran. Boone was on the ground beside the stall, one arm twisted beneath him, a streak of red crawling down from his forearm to his wrist. He tried to rise but winced hard, breath catching. "Stay back," he muttered, half a growl. Ilara ignored him. "You're bleeding." "Not much," he said, but the blood said otherwise. She dropped to her knees beside him, the air thick with the smell of hay and iron. His face was gray under the dust. "You'll be infected if it's not cleaned," she said. He tried to pull his hand free. "I'll manage." "You won't," she said, sharper than she meant to. "You helped me. Let me help you." Boone stilled. The muscles in his jaw moved once, then relaxed. "All right," he said quietly. She guided him to the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. Ilara fetched the pot of boiled water, tore a strip from one of her spare skirts, and set about cleaning the wound. The cut was deep, jagged, edges raw with grit. Her hands trembled only once when he flinched at the sting of the cloth. "Hold still," she whispered. He gave a low chuckle. "You give orders easy for someone who don't trust anyone." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. "Maybe trust comes in pieces." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them buzzed with heat, and something quieter, older. Respect carved out of survival. She threaded the needle with the same green thread she'd used to sew her son's name. Each stitch pulled through his, skin with careful precision, the way she had once patched torn fabric for men who never thanked her. But Boone didn't complain, didn't turn away. He only watched her, eyes dark under the brim of his brow. When the last stitch was tied, she wrapped the cloth around his arm, hands gentle but firm. The movement brought her close enough to feel the warmth of his breath, the scent of sweat and pine smoke. Boone broke the silence first. "You're not afraid of pain." "I am," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just not yours." His eyes lifted to hers, something unspoken flickering there. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding too deep to name. Ilara sat back, studying her work. "That should hold." He flexed his hand and winced. "You sew as neat as you talk." "That's not a compliment," she muttered, but she couldn't hide the faint curve of her mouth. Boone leaned against the post, breathing slow. The cicadas screamed in the trees, their sound rising and falling like a tide. Ash cried inside the cabin, the small, raw cry of hunger. Ilara started to rise, but Boone caught her wrist. "Let me," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. He stood, steadying himself, and disappeared inside. The baby's cries softened. Through the open window, Ilara heard Boone humming low, a tune with no melody, just rhythm, the same as the one he'd used to soothe her fever. When he came back out, the sling around his arm was darkened with sweat, but his eyes were steady again. "You shouldn't be working," she said. "And you shouldn't be afraid," he replied. "But we both do what we can." The line between them thinned then, not broken, not crossed. Just thinner, like a thread pulled tight. Ilara reached out without thinking and pressed her palm to his chest. His heartbeat thudded against her skin. Slow, certain, human. "If I can't trust men," she said quietly, "I still want to trust you." Boone's breath caught. His mouth parted, but no words came. He only nodded once, like an oath he wasn't ready to speak aloud. From inside, Ash whimpered again, reminding them both of the world that still needed tending. Alara pulled her hand back. "You should rest." "I've had worse," he said, a faint smile ghosting his face. She turned toward the door, then paused. "Next time," she said over her shoulder, "you call for help before you fall." He laughed softly. "I'll try." As she disappeared inside, Boone looked down at the stitches, at the green thread glinting faintly in the light, the same color she'd used to name her child. He flexed his hand once more and whispered, "Piece by piece." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Far out on the horizon, a trail of dust began to rise again, small, distant, but moving their way. Boone's gaze hardened. He turned toward the porch and trimmed the lantern's wick. The dawn came gray and trembling, a slow bloom of light across the plains. Fog drifted in thin ribbons over the fields, catching the glow of Boone's lantern where it still burned on the porch. The man hadn't slept. He rarely did when the wind came from the south. It carried the kind of silence that reminded him too much of waiting for something that never came. He stood a long while, hat low, coffee cooling in his hand. The land was so still it could have been sleeping, but he knew better. Out here, nothing ever really slept. It only paused between storms. Inside, Alara stirred the fire. The coals caught with a low sigh, spreading a thin warmth that smelled of pine sap and old smoke. She wrapped Ash tighter, humming softly to keep him calm. Boone heard the tune drift out the door. Gentle, human, the kind of sound that could make a house feel like more than boards and nails. When he finally stepped in, she didn't look up right away. "You're out early," she said, her voice softer now, steady in a way it hadn't been before. "Storms past," Boone replied. "Best time to fix what the wind loosened." She glanced toward the back wall, where the boards still bowed with age. "There's always something loosened." Boone followed her eyes, then nodded. "That room back there's no good. I was thinking of repairing it." "For what?" she asked. "For whoever needs it next." Her brow furrowed. "You mean someone else?" He poured another cup of coffee, the steam ghosting upward. "Folks don't stop getting lost just because one of them's been found." Alara stared at him for a long moment. He didn't look at her, just kept tracing the rim of the mug with his thumb. "You talk like a preacher," she said quietly. He shook his head. "Preachers talk about heaven. I'm talking about a dry bed and four walls that don't ask questions." That afternoon, he pulled the old boards off the back wall, the sound of splitting wood ringing sharp through the still air. Alara worked beside him, sweeping dust and cobwebs from corners, hauling broken planks out to the yard. Ash lay in a cradle near the doorway, watching them like he understood. Boone handed her a hammer once, and their fingers brushed. Rough skin against smooth, the kind of touch that said more than it meant to. Neither mentioned it. They worked until the light thinned and their shadows stretched long across the yard. Sweat streaked Boone's temples. Alara's arms ached, but she didn't stop. There was something almost holy in the quiet rhythm they built together. Hammer, breath, wind, heartbeat. When evening came, Boone stood back, hands on his hips, looking at what they'd done. The roof no longer leaked. The floor was patched. A narrow window let in the last thin thread of sun. The air smelled of sawdust and sage. "It'll do," he said. Ilara smiled, small but true. "It's more than most get." Boone walked to the porch, pulled a small brass lantern from the shelf, and placed it on the table near the window. "We'll keep this one burning too," he said. She frowned lightly. "You mean for someone who isn't here yet?" "For whoever's walking the road tonight." There was no argument to give. She only nodded, eyes tracing the light that flickered in the glass. As the sun dropped, the sky bled orange and violet. Coyotes began to howl far off, their cries thin against the growing dark. Ilara fed Ash and rocked him slow. Boone fixed the latch on the door, his movements quiet, deliberate. Then came the sound. Hooves on gravel, slow and uneven. Boone froze, his hand hovering near the rifle that leaned against the wall. Ilara turned toward the window, heart hammering. A figure appeared through the dust. A girl, barely 17, barefoot, a torn dress clinging to her frame. She held something tight to her chest. A small, wrapped bundle that looked too light to be food and too precious to be trash. Boone stepped down from the porch, one hand raised. "Evenin', miss," he said. The girl's voice trembled. "They told me there was a place out here where a woman might rest." He studied her, the dirt on her face, the cut on her lip, the exhaustion that lived in her eyes. "You heard right." He said. "Come on in." Ilara was already at the door. The girl hesitated before crossing the threshold, as though expecting a trap. When her bare foot touched the wood floor, she looked like she might collapse. "What's your name?" Ilara asked softly. "June. June Pike." Ilara nodded. "June, this is Boone Mercer. You're safe here." June's gaze flicked from one to the other, uncertain. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You won't," Ilara said, her voice firm but kind. "All we ask is that you sleep." Boone gestured toward the back room. "We just finished fixing it. Bed's clean. Roof holds." June stepped inside. The room still smelled of wood and new nails, but the lantern on the windowsill gave it a softness, a heartbeat. She touched the blanket with her fingertips, and something inside her cracked. Tears slid down her cheeks, quiet as the wind outside. Ilara sat beside her on the edge of the bed, brushing her shoulder lightly. "It's all right," she whispered. "You can cry here. You can rest." Boone turned away, giving them the privacy words couldn't. He walked back to the porch, leaned against the post, and watched the last of the daylight bleed away. When Ilara joined him, the baby asleep against her shoulder, she said, "She'll sleep through the night." Boone nodded. "Then that's all that matters." Ilara looked at him for a long time. "You knew someone like her, didn't you?" His jaw tightened. "Once." He didn't say more, and she didn't ask. Inside, the new lantern glowed through the window, its light joining the one on the porch. From the road, anyone passing might have mistaken the house for a way station, a beacon in the nothing. Boone pulled out the old handkerchief from his pocket, the one with sage leaves stitched into the edge. He turned it over in his hands. "She'll need her own soon," he said quietly. Alara smiled faintly. "You plan on sewing?" "I can learn," he said. Later, when the child was asleep and the air smelled of cooling earth, Boone sat at the table with needle and thread. His stitches were clumsy, uneven, but he worked slow, careful. Alara watched from the doorway, the soft lamplight catching the green thread in his hands. "What are you adding?" she asked. He didn't look up. "A border," he said. "Everything worth keeping needs one." The room fell still except for the sound of crickets. Alara stepped closer, watching the lanterns glow. The front porch, the back room, the one between them both. 3 lights now, breathing together in the same rhythm. "You're building something here, Boone Mercer," she said quietly. He set the cloth down, looked up at her, and answered, "Not building, mending." Outside, the prairie sighed under the night wind. The chime under the eaves rang once, then fell silent. And for the first time, the name came to her without fear or question. "Rest here," Alara whispered. Boone looked toward the door where June slept, then to the lamp flickering steady against the dark. He nodded once, slow, as though sealing a promise. "Rest here," he echoed. The house, small, patched together, seemed to breathe then like something alive, finally remembering what it was made for. The next spring came quietly, as if afraid to break what had begun to heal. The frost loosened its grip on the earth. Grass pushed up between the fence boards. Calves called across the valley. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste of ash. Boone was teaching June to saddle a horse when Alara stepped out into the soft morning light. Little Ash toddled behind, laughing like a bird that had remembered how to sing. In the pen, Cinder, the scarred black mare, stood watchful. She'd never trusted any hands but Boone's. "Careful, Ash," Boone called, gentle. Alara reached for the boy, but Boone lifted a hand. "Wait." Ash reached up. Cinder lowered her head, warm breath ruffling his hair. Small fingers pressed to her muzzle, hesitant, curious. The mare exhaled and loosened. Tension melted from the yard like frost under sun. Boone's voice dropped, almost to himself. "She's never let anyone do that." Alara rested her palm on Cinder's shoulder. "She remembers." "Remembers what?" "That kindness can come from smaller hands." Later, with the sun gone honey gold, Boone mended a leather strap on the porch. Alara set down a basket of washed herbs. Sage clung to her sleeves. "You ever wonder why you found me that day?" "I reckon I was found, too." "How do you mean?" Boone's gaze went distant. "Years back, a snowstorm near took me. An old man dragged me from the drift, gave me half his fire and a place to sleep, asked nothing, left me a cloth his wife had sewn for their boy. Alara understood. The sage-stitched handkerchief. Boone nodded toward the far horizon. At Red Hollow, I remembered that fire. Figured I owed the world a warm debt. You've paid it, she whispered. Debts like that don't get paid, he said. They get passed on. The wind stirred the chime under the eaves, older now, clearer for the weather. June hung laundry. Ash scooped dust into small offerings at Cinder's hooves. The picture was ordinary and miraculous. Boone trimmed the porch lantern's wick. Storm'll come again one day. Then we'll light it again, Alara answered. Dusk spread over the valley, the air sweetened with cooling dust. Inside, June set the table, humming the tune Alara once sang in fever. Cinder grazed at the fence. Ash toddled forward, palms of grass offered like a prayer. The mare bowed and received it. Boone, you see that? Alara, the world remembering itself? Something like that. 3 lanterns found their breath. One on the porch, one in the back room, one in the kitchen window, flickering in turn as if breathing together. You said you don't build things. You mend them, Alara murmured. Boone held her gaze. Then we best keep stitching. Her fingers brushed his wrist, brief, lingering, 2 survivors learning touch without apology. From beyond the fence, the faint rhythm of distant hooves, then silence. The world held its breath. Boone didn't reach for the gun, not this time. He looked to the lamps, steady and sure, and said, almost to himself, not every sound means danger. Alara's hand tightened around his. No, sometimes it means someone's coming home. And somewhere inside, June's laughter joined the wind. Thin, bright, alive. The lamps held their flame, stitched light across the dark. A small house breathing, mended and whole enough to welcome morning. The day rose white and merciless. The sun glared down like judgment, baking the dust until it shimmered. The town of Red Hollow lay ahead. Same warped signs, same leaning saloon porch, same smell of sweat and gun oil. Only the silence was different. People watched from windows as Boone Mercer rode in alone. He wore no hat now. His duster was clean but sun-faded, and the old revolver at his hip looked freshly oiled. Each hoofbeat struck the dirt like a clock ticking down. Harlan Voss waited in the street. Gray coat sharp against the white sky, one hand resting lazy on a pearl-handled pistol. His grin was a wound that had never healed right. Didn't think you'd show, Voss called. You talk too loud for me not to, Boone said, steady. Still playing hero for that girl? Boone swung down from the saddle. She's got a name. Auction was illegal, Voss spat. Means she's unpaid property. I'm here to settle. You can try, Boone answered. The sheriff stood halfway between them, eyes darting like a trapped bird. Let's make this clean. High noon. No bystanders. No bystanders, Boone agreed. When the clock struck, the town held its breath. The air shimmered with heat. Boone's hand hovered above his revolver, fingers still as rope before a pull. 3, 2. The gunfire cracked the silence, lightning splitting wood. One bullet tore dust, missing wide. Boone's didn't. His shot struck Voss's shoulder, spinning him down hard. Boone walked forward calm until his shadow fell across the man. "Men don't buy lives," he said quietly, "and I don't shoot to prove I can." He turned away before the sheriff reached them. By the time Boone left Red Hollow, the sky had cooled. The wind smelled of cedar again, and the sun felt less cruel. He rode home without hurry, the kind of ride a man takes when there's no one left to chase him. At the ranch, Ilara stood waiting by the gate. She didn't call out, just exhaled one trembling breath. Ash toddled toward the fence. June followed close. Boone dismounted, dirt whispering beneath his boots. "It's done." "Did you?" "No one died." Tears came anyway. Relief spoke its own language. Inside, the cabin glowed with evening light. Boone washed the dust from his hands. Ilara ladled soup. June set the table, careful and proud. The air smelled of thyme and smoke. After supper, when Ash slept and dusk turned blue, Boone sat on the porch. Ilara joined him. The lantern burned steady between them. "You think they'll come again?" "Maybe, but they'll find a different house." Crickets sang. The wind moved through grass. June hummed a soft tune inside. "You ever think about what you'll do when peace stays? Maybe teach the next one how to breathe easy." Boone looked at his hands. "I don't have much to give. No ring, no land papers, just a name." "What name?" "Mercer." Her eyes caught the light. "I was sold once," she whispered. "This time I choose." Boone's voice softened. "So is that a yes?" "It's a yes." They sat there as the night gathered, quiet as prayer, the lamp's gold light weaving across their hands. 2 years later, the Morel homestead looked different. Not richer, not grander, just fuller. Time 500 mems. The fence stretched farther. Laundry waved in soft rows. Laughter carried on the wind. Behind the house stood a new bunkhouse, its door carved with a single phrase: "Rest here." Some who came stayed a day, some a season. None left empty-handed. Ilara taught them to cook, to mend, to rest. Boone taught them to ride, to plant, to build fences that held but didn't cage. At night, the lanterns flickered. 3 lights breathing together, calling to anyone still lost on the road. One evening, little Sparrow traced the faint ring on her mother's ankle. "What's that, Mama?" "A scar from a lock someone put on me." "Why?" "They forgot I was a person." "That was silly." "Yes," Ilara said softly. "It was. No one will lock you again." "No, baby, not ever again." Outside, Boone hammered the last board on the barn door. The setting sun turned everything to gold. The grass, the house, the faces of those once called less than human. He looked toward the porch. Ilara waved. He tipped his hat. Simple. Eternal. When darkness came, the house shone from miles away. 3 lanterns burning steady, light flickering across the endless plain. "You ever think about that first night?" Boone asked. "I remember the sound of your lamp," Ilara said. still burns the same. Not quite, she smiled. Now it burns for more of us. And so it did. Because out here, heroes didn't ride with badges or bullets. They mended what the world had broken. They gave the lost a bed, a light, and a name. And sometimes, that was enough to save everything that mattered as the lanterns of Rest Here burn against the night. We hope this story touched something quiet inside you. The part that still believes in kindness, second chances, and the power of simply letting someone rest. Out here in the wide country of memory and dust, sometimes a bed, a meal, or a gentle word is enough to bring a soul home. If this tale warmed your heart, dear listener, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us what part spoke to you. Boone's steadfastness, Ilara's courage, or maybe the way the light never quite went out. Please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more quiet, human stories from the old frontier, where love rides slower but lasts longer. From all of us who still believe in soft endings and steady hearts. Thank you for riding with us tonight. May your lamps burn steady, your sleep be peaceful, and your mornings begin with light.